There's a story in 1 Samuel where a woman, dying in childbirth, names her newborn son with a single word that means the glory has departed, and that name followed him for the rest of his life. Scripture doesn't record him ever going by anything else. To be clear upfront, this isn't a video meant to shame anyone who already has one of these names, or a superstition about magic words controlling your fate. It's about a real principle Scripture takes seriously, that in the biblical world, names were understood to carry meaning, and sometimes even shape identity, in a way modern culture mostly treats as decorative. This isn't going to be a list of literal words you should cross off a baby name website. It's going to be a look at the actual reasoning Scripture uses, so you can apply the principle yourself, or whatever specific name you're actually considering. You'll notice these 7 aren't random trivia. Each one ties to an actual documented moment in Scripture where a name and a life intersected in a way the text itself found worth recording. Here are 7 biblical categories of names Scripture actually warns against or reconsiders, and the real reasoning behind each one. 1. Names tied to departed glory. Ichabod. The first category is a name that permanently marks a tragedy instead of a person. In 1 Samuel 4, a woman goes into labor the moment she hears both her husband and father-in-law have died and the Ark of God has been captured. With her last words, she names her son Ichabod, meaning the glory has departed, and dies. That child would carry a name meaning national catastrophe for the rest of his life, every single time anyone spoke it to him. Notice, 2. That nobody in Scripture is recorded correcting this particular name the way Jacob corrects Ben-Oni. Ichabod carries that name for the rest of the narrative, unchanged. It's the difference between telling your child the story of a hard season your family survived, and literally introducing them to every new person in their life as that hard season, forever. Practically, there's a real difference between honoring a hard season your family walked through and permanently attaching a child's identity to the worst day their family ever had. 2. Names that curse a child with sorrow before life begins. Ben-Oni versus Benjamin. The second category is a name given entirely out of grief, before the child has had a single day to be anything else. Rachel, dying during childbirth, names her son Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow. Jacob, her husband, immediately renames him Benjamin instead, son of my right hand, a name of strength and honor. Scripture records the correction happening right there, in the same passage. This is one of the few places in Scripture where a father's decision about a name is recorded as directly overriding a mother's dying request, which itself signals how seriously naming was taken. Comment below, do you think Jacob was right to override Rachel's dying wish, or should the name have stayed? Practically, Jacob's move here is instructive. He didn't erase his grief over losing Rachel. He simply refused to let his son carry that grief as a lifelong label. 3. Names that freeze bitterness as an identity. Mara. The third category is a name that locks a season of bitterness in place as your permanent identity. After losing her husband and both sons, Naomi tells people, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." It's not technically a name given to a child, but the principle is identical. She's asking an entire community to address her, every day, by her worst season. It's the same instinct as a business that suffered one terrible year renaming itself permanently after that single year, instead of the decades of good years before and after it. Practically, by the end of the story, Naomi is called by her original name again, not Mara. Even Scripture doesn't let the bitter season become her final identity, and it's worth asking whether we do that to ourselves, or to our kids, more permanently than the story ever intended. We're about halfway through, and so far, these have all been about grief-based names. The next 4 shift into something different, names tied to character, to false gods, and to a warning that's honestly the hardest one on this list. 4. Names given in pain without a reframe. Jabez. The fourth category is a name given specifically because of the pain surrounding the birth, with no attempt at reframing at all. 1 Chronicles 4 says plainly, his mother named him Jabez, saying, "I gave birth to him in pain." That's the entire explanation Scripture gives, pain named directly onto the child. And yet Jabez grows up to become more honorable than his brothers, and prays a specific, bold prayer asking God to bless him and enlarge his territory, a prayer Scripture says God granted. It's worth noting Jabez doesn't ask God to give him a new name. He asked God to bless the life attached to the name he already had, which is its own kind of answer to this whole list. Practically, Jabez's story isn't only a caution. It's also proof that a painful name doesn't have to be a permanent sentence. But notice it took an actual, deliberate prayer to reroute what the name had already set in motion. 5. Names that directly describe bad character. Nabal. The fifth category is a name that Scripture explicitly says match the person's actual character, word for word. In 1 Samuel 25, a wealthy but cruel man is described this way. He is just like his name means fool, and folly goes with him. Nabal's own wife says this about him, to his face, essentially. Scripture doesn't say the name caused his foolishness, but it does treat the match between name and character as significant enough to state directly. This is worth sitting with, because it flips the usual question people ask about names, not just does this sound nice, but is there any version of this name's meaning I'd be uncomfortable seeing fulfilled? Practically, this is less about avoiding a specific word, and more about the broader caution, naming a child after a trait or an association you wouldn't actually want to describe their character someday. 6. Names that honor false gods. Ish-baal. The sixth category is a name that directly honors a false god, even unintentionally. Saul's son is named Ish-baal, literally man of Baal, the storm god worshipped by Israel's neighbors, likely without Saul intending any actual worship of Baal by the name itself. Later biblical writers were uncomfortable enough with this that in some texts his name is changed to Ish-bosheth, man of shame, specifically to remove the reference to a false god from Scripture's own record. This doesn't mean every name with an unfamiliar root is secretly dangerous. It means it's worth actually knowing what a name means and references before assuming it's neutral. Practically, this category is about paying attention to what a name might be quietly invoking or honoring, even if that's not the intent, because Scripture's own scribes apparently cared enough about this to actually edit the record. 7. Names tied to violence and rejection. Cain. The seventh and final category is a name permanently associated with violence and rejection, right from Scripture's very first family. Cain becomes the first murderer in the Bible, and God marks him as a restless wanderer for the rest of his life. Scripture never records anyone else in the biblical narrative being named Cain again, not once, across the entire rest of the text. Compare that to names like Enoch, Seth, or Noah, which get reused generation after generation. This isn't proof of a strict rule Scripture enforces everywhere. It's a noticeable pattern, the kind worth paying attention to, even if it isn't a hard commandment. Practically, some names carry an association so specific that Scripture itself seems to quietly retire them. That's not a magic rule, it's a pattern worth noticing. A name marking departed glory. A name of sorrow instead of strength. A name freezing bitterness in place. A name given in pain with no refrain. A name matching bad character. A name honoring a false god. A name tied to violence, never reused again. 7 categories, and none of them are about superstition or magic syllables. 7 names, 4,000 years apart in some cases, and the same underlying principle running through every single one of them. The actual principle underneath all 7 is simple. Names were never meant to be neutral decoration in Scripture. They were meant to say something true and good about the person carrying them, which means naming with intention is itself a kind of blessing you get to give your child before they've done anything to earn or deserve it. If you already have one of these names, or gave one to your child without knowing this background, this isn't a video meant to alarm you. Names can be reframed, the same way Jacob reframed Ben-Oni into Benjamin, right there in the same story. Tell me in the comments which of these 7 surprised you the most. And if this gave you something to actually think about the next time you're choosing a name, subscribe, because next time, we're talking about the names Scripture actually celebrates, and why.